Okay, let's look at this function. X squared f of x equals x squared. And let's just take a few elements in the domain, not every possible real number. Let's just say 1 and 2, 3, and let's do -2. So 1 goes to 1, 2 goes to 4, 3 goes to 9, and -2 also goes to 4. Okay, so this function, we already said, is not going to be, it's not going to have an inverse because it's not 1 to 1. Okay, so however, if we limit the domain to only positive numbers, then what? Then we don't have a problem. So let's have just 1, 2, 3, and over here we can have 1 goes to 1, 2 goes to 4, and 3 goes to 9. So if we limit the domain like this, we don't have that problem. And we have this function. Okay, now, and this is y equals f of x equals x squared. Okay, so what would be the inverse of this? For example, what function will take 4 to 2, 9 to 3, let's suppose we had 5, that would have gone to 25. What function, the inverse, what is this inverse function? I guess we want to write x, maybe we should write, I guess we want to write y equals x. What is this function though? So I think it's pretty clear that f inverse is the square root of x. But I've been right, I should have written f of y equals x, but now I want to write f inverse of x just because it looks weird to write f inverse of y equals the square root of y or the square root of x. In either case, it would look strange. So I want to write this as though it's just a regular function, and that we usually put x for the input. So so this function is the square root of x. So in other words, if you have x squared, the inverse of it is the square root of x. That is, if we limit the domain like this. If we have this, we can't talk about the inverse. But if we limit the domain only to positive numbers, we can talk about the inverse. And the inverse is the square root of x. So what if the function had been not x squared, but rather f of x equals x cubed? So what would be the inverse of that? So let's, in this case, actually, we don't have to limit the domain, but let's ignore that. Let's just keep the domain limited. So let's just say 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so 1 goes to 1, even when you cube it, but 2 goes to 8, and 3 goes to 27, and 4 goes to 64, I think. 64. Okay, so if that's f, what is the inverse? So the inverse takes 8 to 2, 27 to 3, 64 to 4, and 1 to 1. So what is that function? I think you probably recognize that that is the cube root of x. The cube root of x. Okay, so if we start out with x cubed, the inverse is the cube root. And this makes sense, right? That is to say that x squared and the square root of x, and the square root of x are inverses, and x cubed and the cube root of x are inverses. That makes sense because if you do, remember we said that if you do f inverse of f of x, you should get x, or we also said if you do f of f inverse of x, you also get x. So we're saying if I, let's say, let's work with this one. So if I do x, f is equal to x squared. So if I do x squared, that means I'm squaring here. I'm squaring the inverse of x. What does the inverse of x have to be in order to get x back? It has to be the square root. So if you do the square root of x squared, you get x. And so squaring and square roots are inverses. These two are inverses. Same thing here. Cubing and cube roots are inverses. So if you do, let's say, f of x equals x cubed, then we would say then f inverse of x is equal to the cube root of x. And then you can check it because you could do f of f inverse of x, and that means you want to take the cube root of x on the inside, that's here, and then you want to cube it because you're putting it into f, and that gives you x. So these two are inverses. Okay, now how about if you have something like f of x equals 3x, what's the inverse going to be? It turns out that the inverse is going to be 1/3 x, or x over 3. So let's check that, see if that works. Okay, so let's say, let's check this, f of f inverse of x. So f inverse we're suggesting is x over 3, and then you're putting that into f, but when you put that into f, you multiply it by 3, so you get 3 times x over 3, which is x, so that works. So the inverse of 3x is x over 3, and of course the inverse of, if f of x was equal to, for example, 10x, the inverse is going to be x over 10. Let's try another one.